Good morning and welcome to Coffee and the Word. So we've been working through the book of Genesis and trying to give you a little context. And as we read through the book of Genesis, we learn a lot about who God is, and we also learn a lot about who we are. And so yesterday we talked about the blessings that God had promised to Abraham and the fact that God is going to accomplish those promises. God is not slack concerning his promise, and he will make sure that everything that he says will happen will happen. You know, God is able to do things that I think sometimes we don't really see. We can't see how God's going to accomplish things. And when we think things are difficult, we tend to get in God's way. And that's what today is about. Today I called, the title of today is The Slippery Slope of Sin. And I think that's where we ought to start, is what is sin? And I think anytime we think of the word sin, our first thought is doing something bad, right? Is doing something that isn't good, is sin. But there's another aspect of sin, which is actually the term literally means to miss the mark. And so even not doing something you should do would be sin. And so here we find Abram has been given a promise. You're going to have so many descendants, and I'm going to give you a land. There's so many things that your name is going to be great, and Abram has no children. And so Sarai comes to Abram, and he's like, well, let's read it. It's found in Genesis chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abraham, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." And so one of the things you notice here is Sarai is getting impatient. Sarai is wondering, why isn't God doing what God should have already done? And we do that a lot with God, I think. I think there's a lot of times when we're going down the road, we're trying to accomplish, or we're trying to first realize the promises of God. We're trying to realize that God is working and he's on our side and he's doing good things, that sometimes we think, well, maybe God needs a little help. He might be busy. All right. Sometimes we think maybe God can't accomplish this thing. It's too much. Maybe God forgot about me. Maybe God's not really working in this. And I don't see how your name is going to be great, Abram. And I don't see how I'm going to build a family, Abram, if we don't do something about this. And I've got a plan. And I'm just going to tell you, one of the things that shouldn't happen in our faith journey is for us to go from God's got a plan to I got a plan. Because anytime we do that, the slippery slope of the reality was it will destroy more than it will ever build. It will hurt more than it will ever help. And so that's what Sarah does. She's like, okay, Abram, I got a plan. I've got this handmaid's Hagar. I think, why don't we use her and we'll get this family started. We're getting old. It's time to do this. And I mean, really, what could go wrong? Right? I mean, she's my handmaid, she's my servant. You go in, we have a child, we'll raise that child if it's our own, and nothing could go wrong here doing this in a way that God hasn't told us to do it, and do it in our own way. It'll be fine. And so here's the other crazy thing. Do you remember back in Genesis chapter 3 when the woman went to the tree and the serpent is talking to the woman, and the woman eats the fruit, and all of us men are like, if it hadn't have been for that woman, right? And, who trying to blame somebody else. I want you to listen to this next verse, because what should happen and what does happen aren't the same thing. So listen to this. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Hey, Abram, you know that whole promise, God, I've got a plan. And Abram's like, okay, I'm good with that. Let's do that. This sounds like, it's your idea. Let's do what you think. I'm going to tell you something. This is for you men out there, for us men out there. It is not a good idea for you to do whatever it is that you think will bring peace or you joy. Sometimes you need to stand up and do and say what the Lord has called you to do and say. Not sometimes, you always need to do this, but there are times when you need to stand up and be the spiritual leader of your family. This is a little side note, but it's imperative. Abram should have said, that is not what God has called us to do. That's not a good idea. And he should have ministered to his wife. He should have helped her understand that though it's not happening in their time frame, God is working it out. It's not what he does, right? What he does is like, okay, that sounds good. Adam, here, eat this fruit. Okay, sounds good. Like, no, it is not your job. Sometimes your wife is going to prevent you and has prevented you from doing things you shouldn't do. Sometimes you need to prevent your wife from doing things she shouldn't do. Stand up and be a leader. So let's keep going, because this is not going to end well. So Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai's wife took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. She slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Imagine that. Then Sarai called to Abraham, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms. Now that I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." And I love this. It's like, this is your fault. Right? That's always our thing is we make bad decisions and we blame other people for the effects of it. But this is your fault, Abram. I'm telling you, you're responsible for the wrong I am suffering. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think is best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. So there's more to this story that I want to deal with maybe in the future. But right now, I want to take you to this reality of what happened. It all starts just like the story of Adam and Eve, just like every story of sin. It starts with just entertaining an ungodly thought. It just, your desire takes you to a place you didn't want to go so that you can get the results you desperately want. And so I just want to encourage you this morning, I think that you would be amazed at how much better your results are if you lived a life in line with what God has called you to do, even when it doesn't make sense to you. There's the old saying, and I hear it all the time. Sin will take you further than you want to go and keep you longer than you wanted to stay. And I'm guaranteeing you, all of us have experienced this. And we can look back and we can give Abram some advice, right? We can give Sarah some advice. I wouldn't do that if I were you. It's not a good idea. And most sin that we commit, hindsight tells us we should have avoided. And that's why the scripture tells us to flee it. We should not run towards sin. We should run from sin. We should resist the devil and let him flee from us. We should draw near to God and he will draw near to us. I don't know what's going on in your life right now, but if your way of dealing with it is to do something that is contrary to what God would call you to do, even though what God is calling you to do may sound impossible, everything is possible with the God that we serve. And there's a whole lot that can go wrong and will go wrong when we do it in service to ourselves. So, the slippery slope of sin took Sarai from building a family to hating her handmaid. Maybe it's time we stop flirting with sin as if it has no destructive power and start believing God, who has unbelievable creative power. I hope you guys have a great day. This has been another edition of Coffee and the Word.